Hello, Robs. I'm back with the Haunted Homestead, even though it only says Haunted Homestead instead not. I've retired this copy. As you can see, this is falling apart, and this arrived in the mail this morning, so I'm just going with this because I don't want to ruin the book the other booklet any further. I've found the page where I left off, which is page 33 at this point. Late that afternoon, Uncle Judah was dispatched with the mules to Frost Height to meet the stagecoach and bring Rachel Knowles to the house. And about 7 o'clock he returned, escorting the new visitor for whom we were waiting tea. As Miss Knowles was to be my roommate, I examined her with much more interest than I had bestowed upon any other among my fellow visitors. Rachel Knowles was an orphan and was still in deep mourning for her father, who had been dead about 9 months. She was a very pretty, timid-looking girl, with a fair face, soft brown hair, and large hazel eyes. Ah, my dear child, I thought to myself, you are scarcely the most proper denizen for a crime-cursed, haunted chamber. And I made up my mind to protect her, if possible, from the knowledge that would only make her wretched and perhaps drive her away from the place. And this was the fourth evening of Christmas revelry, and we had all been up to a very late hour upon each of the 3 preceding nights. It was moved, seconded, and carried by a large majority that we should retire early on this and the succeeding evenings of the week, so as to recruit a little for the New Year's festivity. Accordingly, at 10 o'clock, we separated. Mrs. Laguerre and Mathilde accompanied Rachel Knowles, and you'll notice if you follow any of these other videos that Mrs. Eden Southworth, tends to use the full name of the person. I'm not sure why. Mrs. Laguerre and Mathilde accompanied Rachel Knowles and myself to our chamber. And when our hostess and her daughter had seen that the room was in perfect order, the fire burning well, the beds turned down, the ewers filled, etc., they took leave, waiting as before until they had heard me lock the chamber door behind them. When they had passed down the stairs and out at the hall door and locked it after them, I turned around to meet the surprised look of Rachel Knowles. "Why, where have they gone?" she asked. "Into the old house. To bed." "Why? Do they sleep there?" "Certainly, the whole family sleep there." "And who sleeps here in the new house?" "No one but you and I." "You don't mean to say that they have put us in this house to sleep alone?" "Why not? It is an adjunct to the other house, which is besides quite full of guests." "It was so when I came. And where did you sleep?" "Here, alone." "Certainly?" Jesus. "Alone?" "Certainly." She looked at me with astonishment, and had my mind been sufficiently at ease, I should have enjoyed her naive admiration. But it was not so, and when I saw her draw her chair up in front of the fire and sit down immediately over that spot, I shuddered and spoke to her. "Rachel, dear, don't sit directly in front of the fire. It is injurious to the eyes." She moved to one side and began to unfasten her dress preparatory to going to bed. We were now ready, but before lying down, Rachel asked me, "Is the door secure?" "Yes, my dear." "And the windows?" "Yes." Not quite content with my answer, Rachel went slyly around to all the windows, and then to the door to ascertain their security. Then she searched the closets and finally got into bed. I soon followed her example, but I found myself more sleepless than upon the preceding evening. I know not exactly how long I had lain awake, thinking of the dead proprietors of Madeline van der Vaughan, and her sad history and tragic fate, whatever they might have been, and of the stern, dark woman of my dream, and of the blood-stained floor, and trying to combine these materials into some coherent whole, when suddenly I heard the lock click back, the door swing slowly open, and a rustle as of silken drapery. And I opened my eyes to behold the awful woman of my dream standing in the middle of the room and pointing sternly to the blood-stained floor. And in the very same instant that I heard and saw this, Rachel had also been awakened and was now even and was even now asking in frightened tones, "Who is that?" But there was no answer. "Who is that?" again asked the girl, and still there was no answer. "Who is that?" she reiterated emphatically. No answer. "Aunt Laguerre, Mathilde, Jet, who is it?" No reply, but the tall, black-robed woman standing motionless and pointing with spectral finger to the spot on the floor. "Oh, dear me, Agnes, Agnes," I answered. "What, my dear? Have you opened the door?" "No, love." "Have you been up all that at all since you lay down?" "No, Rachel." "Who opened the door?" "I do not know." "Didn't you hear it open?" "Yes." "And it is open now?" "I see it is. But how came it open?" "I do not know. Perhaps it was not quite locked, and the catch flew back." "Oh, perhaps that was it," said Rachel, and though her teeth were chattering with a nervous tremor, she got out of bed and went to the door to close and lock it. And reader, the black-robed woman passed out before her, and she saw her not. I fell back upon my pillow, nearer swooning than ever I had been in my life. For now I knew that this was no dream, but a vision, an apparition to me, and to me only. I slept no more that night. And in the morning, when I arose and looked into the glass, I was startled at the haggardness of my own face. When we appeared at the breakfast table, some of the young people remarked my paleness and said that I had been frolicking more than was good for me. Then one of the company inquired of Rachel Knowles how she had rested. "Not very well," Rachel answered. "I was frightened by the door flying open in the middle of the night." I noticed a quick, intelligent look pass between Mathilde and her mother, while Rachel continued. "I thought at first that it was thieves breaking in, but I know now that it flew open because Agnes had not locked the door fast enough to hold it." "No, I had not," said I. The arrival of the mailbag put an end to this discussion. The letters were distributed at the table. Among them was one from my brother to Mr. Laguerre, accepting his invitation for himself and his friend, whom he begged to name as the Honorable Francis Howard of Massachusetts, and announcing the letter as a mere avant-courrier of the party which would reach Frost Height that afternoon. Upon hearing the name of Frank Howard as the friend of John and their expected guest, Mathilde flushed and paled, and was quite unable to conceal from the interested scrutiny of her parents the emotion these tidings caused her. As for Mr. Laguerre, upon reading his name, he said "humph" and "humph" very emphatically, several times before he could get any further. But he considered his hospitality implicated. Nay, his honor pledged to receive and treat with politeness the guest that he had so unconsciously invited. He was a fine old gentleman, notwithstanding his prejudices, was Mr. Laguerre. So in the afternoon, once more, Uncle Judah was ordered to take the mules and go up to Frost Height to meet the stagecoach and bring 2 visitors to the house, an order so little to the old man's satisfaction that he vented his disapprobation in the exclamation, "Old Massa Betta had set up entertainment for man and beast at once." As usual, when expecting a new arrival of visitors, Mrs. Laguerre put back her tea hour and prepared a supper of extra luxuriousness. And Mr. Laguerre brewed the great ancestral punch bowl to the brim with rich, frothy eggnog, and set it away to mellow against the coming of the gentlemen. My dear mother and father, they have noble hearts in spite of their social conservatism, and you shall see that they will treat my Frank with as much kindness and respect as if they did not consider him a sort of wolf prowling about after their one ewe lamb," said Mathilde, with tears of affection brimming to her eyes. "And you see, my darling, it is as I foretold you it would be. He is seeking you now in your own home, and under what favorable circumstances the invited guest of your father. How very providential, the whole train of events. Trust still in divine providence. And if your love is a true love, it will end happily," I answered. And in my deep sympathy with Mathilde's joy, I almost forgot that I was a haunted maiden, with some as yet unknown supernatural mission to accomplish. I was resolved, if possible, before the day should be over, to hear from Mathilde the tragic story of Madeline Vandervon, whose portrait I had mentally identified as that of the awful visitant of my midnight hours. The opportunity came, or rather I made it. Mathilde had early completed her toilet for the evening. I had done likewise, and at 5 o'clock we found ourselves alone together in the drawing room of the new house. The lamps were not as yet lighted. The hickory fire had ceased to blaze and now only burned redly, showing out a strong, solid heat in what Uncle Judah called solemn columns, and casting over the dark chamber a somber, ruddy twilight. We sat down by the fire together. There would be no chance for the next half hour of being interrupted, for Mr. Laguerre was still engaged at his breakfast in the dining room. Mrs. Laguerre was busy in her pantry and the kitchen, and the few servants of the now reduced establishment were in constant attendance upon their master or mistress. Rachel Knowles was upstairs in my chamber, dressing for the evening, and the other young persons of the Christmas party were in the bedrooms of the old house, similarly engaged. There was not the slightest possibility of an interruption. Mathilde commenced speaking. "I believe you are pleased with your chamber, Agnes?" "Charmed," I answered. Without perceiving the double entendre hidden in my reply, she said, "And you have always slept well, then?" "Never better," I replied, "in that chamber," I mentally added. In her ignorance of this silent reservation, she was pleased with my answer, and sat smiling quietly, and studying, apparently, the glowing coals of fire in the chimney place. I broke her reverie by saying in a careless, offhand way, "Apropos de rien." "Rien? You have not told me the story of the mysterious portrait yet." "No, I haven't, but indeed I am not sure that the history of Madeline Vandervon has anything to do with that portrait, since I am not sure that it is hers. No matter, take it for granted that it is, or at least tell the story whether or not." "Very well, listen then," said Mathilde, settling herself comfortably in her chair and commencing the narrative. "The Vandervons, as you may perceive by their name, are of Teutonic origin, though by frequent intermarriage with other races they have no doubt lost or modified many of their national traits. Their residence in this part of the country dates back to the time of the first settlement of New York by the Dutch. Why this particular family should have wandered down to the backwoods and mountains of Virginia remains a mystery, unless they were of a patriotic and poetical turn, and found in her wild hills and boundless woods something to remind them of the Hartz Mountains and the Black Forest. However that may be, they came, took up a great tract of land, built themselves a dwelling place, the old house adjoining this, and settled down permanently. For a time they were prosperous, as others were, and then by bad agriculture they grew poor, as others in this neighborhood did. If we may believe tradition, the poorer this family grew, the prouder they became, until at last pride and poverty united, culminated in the character and circumstances of the last heiress of the elder branch of the family, Madeline Vandervon. At the age of 25, Madeline Vandervon was left by the death of her father. Her mother died long before, sole heiress of a worn-out plantation and dilapidated house. Madeline is reported to have possessed great and singular beauty, a tall and imperial form, a fine head with strongly marked and perfectly regular features, a deep, rich complexion, and hair, eyes, and eyebrows, all black as Erebus. Gifted and accomplished was she also, and as I stated, proud as Lucifer. It is said that this overweening pride prevented her taking a husband from among her numerous visitors, none of whom, though of the best families in the state, she deemed worthy of her own high alliance, until at last her relative Ernest Wolfgang Vandervon made his appearance in her train and claimed her hand, a claim that was endorsed by her acceptance. It is said that family pride had to do with this marriage much more than love. However that might be, no sooner was the knot securely tied that Mr. Vander Vaughan began to importune his wife to sell her land and homestead that they might emigrate to the west. But in vain, for Mrs. Vander Vaughan would not for an instant entertain the idea of alienating her patrimony. On the contrary, she had one ambition concerning her inheritance, an ambition that reached the height of a ruling passion, and that was to resuscitate the dead soil of the plantation and to rebuild the mansion house. All Ernest Vander Vaughan's property consisted in bank stock. All Madeline's estate was in worthless land and Negroes. But she offered him as she would not have offered any other than a Vander Vaughan, the fee simple of her plantation, if he would only devote his money to the restoring of the worn-out fields and the rebuilding of the homestead. Ernest did not like the plan, and he told her so. He explained to her how at 1/10 the outlay that he should have to make for manures and for labor to resuscitate this effete soil, he would go to Iowa and purchase a large farm of the richest land and build a comfortable dwelling house and all needful offices around it. But it was in vain that he argued with her. She was a strong-minded, self-willed woman with one idea, one monomania, love for old Virginia, and especially for her own portion of the soil. She absolutely rejected the plan of emigration and told Ernest in the most decided manner that go where he might, she would never desert her birthplace. She was the stronger of the two, and she prevailed. Ernest embarked nearly all his means in the doubtful enterprise of restoring the old, worn-out fields and rebuilding the mansion, or rather, I should say, repairing it and building a new house beside it. Madeline, on her part, kept her word. She executed the deed conveying the whole property to her husband, and after he, in a fit of generous abandonment, tore that deed and threw it in the fire, she made a second one, caused it to be recorded, and thus rendered it irrevocable, or irrevocable, as most people would say, but I like the harsh tones of irrevocable, before she told him anything about it. She went even further than this and aided him in every possible way in his work of restoration. To retrench expenses so that every spare dollar should go to that enterprise, she discharged her housekeeper, reduced her establishment of servants, and took upon her own shoulders the additional burdens lately borne by those whom she had discharged from her service. She worked hard and constantly. No one knew how severely she toiled, not even her husband, until her labors seriously affected her health. Then Ernest Vander Vaughan remonstrated. But she smiled and pointed to the growing fields and to the rising mansion. Yet the restoration of the lands and the elevation of the house was a work of years. Often progress was arrested by the want of funds, and then, though it cost the mistress many severe heart pangs, one after another of the old family servants were sold to raise the necessary amount, and their places in the field had to be supplied by fresh drafts upon the small household establishment, until at last the mistress was reduced to one maid of all work about her person. I do not think your citizens, Agnes, dream of how much labor devolves upon the mistress of a large plantation in circumstances such as these. Even when assisted by an efficient housekeeper and many well-trained servants, the duties are onerous, sometimes oppressive. Madeline Vander Vaughan had deprived herself of nearly all help, but most willingly she bore her self-assumed burden, only showing distress when some financial exigency compelled her to wound humanity. She gave her heart, her life, to one object of her ambition. Yes, literally this was so, for it was observable that as the carefully tended land recovered, she lost vitality, and as the mansion arose, she sank. It was in glorious autumn when the richest wheat harvest that had ever been reaped in the state was gathered into the barns of Wolfbrake, and the finest corn crop that had ever grown in the valley stood ripe in the fields, that the house was finished. So much money had been spent and so many debts remained to be paid that there was but little to expend upon furniture, and Mrs. Vandervon could not appoint her house in a style so gorgeous as would have satisfied her ambition. However, it was furnished in the manner that you now see, which, after all, is much handsomer than anything that was known to the grand old Vandervons in their grandest day of, no doubt, fabulous grandeur. It was about the 1st of November that the last of the Vandervons removed into this house. The plastering of the sleeping rooms was not so well dried as had been supposed. This was soon ascertained by Mr. Vandervon, who advised and entreated his wife to delay the removal. But when had Madeline Vandervon yielded to any will but her own? With the impatience and fever of a long desire, she hastened to take possession of her new residence. Although the weather had continued fine, with westerly or southerly winds up to the day of removal, yet then the wind shifted to the east, blowing up masses of dark clouds and cold mists, followed by rain and even sleet. Alas, worn out by self-assumed unnecessary burdens, Madeline Vandervon was in no condition successfully to meet a change of weather and other circumstances. Moreover, she, so earnest in her ambition, so zealous for ostentation, was fatally careless in regard to her own personal comforts. There was no grate or stove in her chamber or in any other room in the house, all dependent upon one fireplace, which, however handsome, cheerful, and poetic they may look, are not always just the very best thing for damp houses in severe weather. Mrs. Vandervon's chamber could not be properly dried and heated. The consequence was that she took a severe cold which fell upon her lungs, and from which she, in her enfeebled state, had not power to recover. She drooped into a rapid consumption, and in 6 weeks from her triumphant entree into her new house, she was borne thence to the family burial ground that you may see from your windows. Poor lady! What room did she occupy? Yours. And she died there? Yes, she died there a victim, I am sure, of her own impatient, feverish ambition. Do not judge her harshly. I do not. This is the reputation she has left behind her. Yet it may not have been her true character. Reputation is one thing, character is another, said I, falling into thought, and then reflecting that much yet must remain to be told to give me a sure clue. And you notice the spelling of clue is C-L-E-W. To the household mystery. Well, what else? I inquired. What else, my dear? Why, nothing else. I have told you all her story to her death, said Mathilde, uneasily. But after all, said I, one of the most interesting things in the connection is your father's purchase of this fine property. Ah, true. Well, after the death of his lady, Ernest Vandervon removed back into the old house and closed up the new one. In the course of a few weeks, he advertised the property for sale, but months passed and no purchaser appeared willing to give him the price set upon the estate. A year went by, and Mr. Vandervon made the acquaintance of a young lady, Alice Brightwell, who was, it is said, as strong a contrast as possible to his late wife, for Alice was young and fair and gay, loved music, dancing, and company, and had not a regret, a care, or an ambition in the world. And then with that, we will pause for the time being and continue tomorrow. Goodbye.